A New Deal for the World, America's Vision for Human Rights by Elizabeth Borgwardt. Elizabeth Borgwardt's 2005 work, A New Deal for the World, argues that the international system created during and just after World War II was largely a product of America's experience with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policies. The conception, negotiation over, and implementation of these policies provided the framework for institutions such as the United Nations, the Nuremberg Trials, the IMF, and the World Bank. Borgwardt begins the work with an examination of the August 1941 Atlantic Charter. The meeting between FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill concluded with a declaration that stated the shared values and aims of the two nations. It also included the essence of the President's four freedoms as critical goals. Borgwardt notes that while Churchill viewed these principles as largely pertaining to Europeans fighting the Nazis, other peoples around the world, such as South Africa's Nelson Mandela, took the Charter's phrase, all the men, literally, noting the Declaration's inherent paradox. Quote, Mandela's understanding of the Charter was a global statement of principles with an anti-colonial as well as an anti-Nazi message. The book goes on to examine the creation of various international institutions and ideas, and ties them to America's experience with government policies during the Great Depression and World War II. For instance, when during the war Roosevelt stated that America no longer needed Dr. New Deal, but instead must be treated by Dr. Win the War, Borgwardt argues that this did not mean that the New Deal was abandoned, but rather transformed. Quote, a new iteration of the New Deal was becoming nothing less than America's vision for the post-war world. Borgwardt argues that it was the experiences of the Great Depression that made Americans willing to intervene in the world after World War II, as opposed to withdraw from the international stage as they had done after World War I. America's willingness to experiment on a grand scale and exert more direct control over the economy and society during the crisis conditions of the Depression prepared the American people for a new, dynamic role in world affairs. The chapter dealing with the International Military Tribunal is particularly interesting as it explored the creation and application of international law. While the architects of the Treaty of Versailles had called for the arrest and trial of Kaiser Wilhelm II, no tribunal of any note occurred after that conflict. The victors of World War II were determined not to repeat that mistake, and constructed legal, physical, and scientific instruments with all of the logistical brilliance and immediacy of a military campaign. In doing so, the Allies also created a mechanism for international justice, not just as a concept, but as a pillar of the post-war international order. Borgwardt, a lawyer as well as a historian, presented her argument with a commanding scholarship. Her bibliography contained a number of primary documents, including many she dissects with a surgeon's skill. The United Nations Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, and of course the Atlantic Charter. Additionally, she drew upon congressional records, State Department documents, and other government sources. Her secondary sources include Jeffrey Best's Humanity and Warfare, the Modern History of the International Law of Armed Conflict, Robert Gilpin's War and Change in World Politics, and Robert Randy's The Origins of Peace, a study of peacemaking and the structures of peace settlements, to name a few. A New Deal for the World is astonishing in its scope and the power of its argument. Borgwardt effectively makes her point by intricately tracing America's experience with the international failures of World War I to the towering powerhouse that guided much of the planet after World War II. This work is much more than a simple history, however. It is a deep legal and historical analysis, carefully woven together and offering a unique perspective into the beginnings of the modern world. Borgwardt presents the same contradictions of the Allies, fighting for freedom and core values while jealously guarding their prerogatives and leading roles on the world stage. At the same time, she offered that the post-World War II creations, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, etc., were fundamentally American creations, perhaps not entirely in their constitution, but certainly in their conception.